What happens when you discover your own family sees you as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance? Let me know in the comments if you have ever felt that sinking realization that the people closest to you might not have your best interests at heart. This story might hit close to home for many of us. On my 67th birthday, my son Marcus surprised me with an invitation to his mountain cabin in Colorado. After 3 years of barely speaking, I thought maybe he would finally forgiven me for selling the family farm. But on our second evening there, the young resort worker slipped me a folded napkin while clearing my dinner plate. Written in shaky handwriting were 4 words that made my blood freeze. "Check your coffee cup, my own son, my firstborn." The child I had raised alone after his father died in that logging accident. I stared at Marcus across the rustic dining table, his face lit by candlelight, smiling that familiar crooked smile I had loved since he was 5 years old. But now that smile looked different, calculated, cold. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I sat in a place designed for healing and reconnection, surrounded by the majestic beauty of snow, capped peaks and pristine wilderness, while my own flesh and blood was slowly poisoning me. The contradiction felt surreal, like discovering a viper in a bouquet of roses, beautiful on the surface but deadly at its core. I thought about all those years I had spent worrying about him as a child, staying up nights when he had fever, driving hours to his soccer games, working double shifts at the diner so he could have the school supplies and clothes his classmates took for granted. I remembered the way he used to run to me after school, bursting with stories about his day, his small hands sticky with playground dirt as he wrapped his arms around my waist. When had that bright-eyed boy turned into this stranger across from me? When had my unconditional love become something he saw as an obstacle to overcome rather than a gift to treasure? So what do you do when the person you sacrificed everything for decides your life has become inconvenient? The morning of my birthday started like any other quiet Tuesday in Millbrook, Montana, population 3,847, on a good day. The October air carried that crisp bite that reminded you winter was coming whether you were ready or not. I was watering the geraniums on my front porch, the same clay pots I had been nurturing for 6 years now since moving to this little rental house on Maple Street. The morning routine had become sacred to me: coffee first, then the plants, then settling in with whatever book was calling to me from the stack beside my reading chair. The neighborhood was waking up slowly. Mrs. Henderson across the street was already out walking her ancient golden retriever, both of them moving at the same arthritic pace. 2 houses down, the Johnsons' teenage son was scraping ice off his windshield with what looked like a credit card, probably running late for school again. Normal Tuesday sounds, car doors slamming, coffee makers gurgling to life, the distant hum of morning news broadcasts drifting through screen doors. I had been living this quiet life for 4 years now, ever since I sold the family farm and moved to town. The farm had been in Robert's family for 3 generations, 160 acres of wheat fields and cattle pasture that had sustained us through good years and lean ones. But after my heart attack and the subsequent surgery that left me with a scar down my chest and a medicine cabinet full of pills, I couldn't manage the physical demands anymore. The decision to sell hadn't been easy. I had walked every fence line, sat in every room of the old farmhouse, memorizing the way morning light fell across the kitchen table, where Robert and I had shared 43 years of breakfasts. I had traced my fingers along the doorframe where we had marked Marcus's height each birthday, watching those pencil lines climb higher and higher until he towered over both of us. But keeping the farm would have meant watching it deteriorate while I couldn't maintain it, and that felt like a betrayal of everything Robert had built. So I sold it to the Thompson family, young folks with 2 small children and dreams as big as the Montana sky. At least it would stay a working farm instead of being carved up into developments. The money from the sale had paid for my heart surgery, covered the outstanding medical bills that had been piling up, and left me with enough to buy this small house outright and live modestly on my Social Security and the small pension from my years working at the county clerk's office. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable and debt-free, with a roof over my head and enough left over for the occasional dinner out with friends. Marcus hadn't seen it that way. To him, I had sold his inheritance, his birthright, his future security. Never mind that he had moved to Denver after college and hadn't shown any interest in farming. Never mind that he had a successful software consulting business and a six-figure income. Never mind that he had married Patricia, whose family had money dating back to her great-grandfather's mining investments. The last conversation we had had was burned into my memory like a brand. He would stood in my kitchen, his face red with anger, while Patricia sat at the table looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing to defend me. "You had no right," he had said, his voice shaking with rage. "That farm was supposed to be mine someday. You have thrown away everything Dad built, everything our family worked for, just because you are too stubborn to accept help." I had tried to explain about the medical bills, about my inability to work the land, about wanting the farm to remain a farm rather than deteriorate under my failing care. But he had walked out before I could finish, taking Patricia and Emma with him. That was 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Not that I was counting. When I noticed the overnight delivery truck pulling away from my house, I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with hope that had become my default response to unexpected mail. On my doorstep sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. No return address visible, just my name written in block letters I didn't recognize. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it while I finished my coffee. Part of me was afraid to open it, afraid it might be something hurtful. Another legal document or bill I had forgotten about. But another part of me hoped desperately that it might be something good, something that would break the silence that had settled between Marcus and me, like a thick blanket of snow. Inside was a printed invitation card with gold edges, the kind you might get for a wedding or anniversary party. But the message was simple and unexpected. "Dorothy, join us for a long overdue family reunion. Mountain View Lodge, the 15th of September, -20th, all expenses covered. Just bring yourself and an open heart. Marcus and Patricia." I read those words so many times that morning that I could have recited them in my sleep. Marcus hadn't called me by my first name since he was 12 years old, back when he was trying to sound grown up and important. He had always been Mom this and Mom that, until Patricia came along, and suddenly I became Dorothy, like I was just another person in his life, instead of the woman who had raised him alone after his father's accident. The formal tone of the invitation puzzled me too. Marcus had never been one for fancy gestures or elegant language. He was direct, sometimes bluntly so, just like his father had been. This invitation felt different, more polished, like something Patricia might have suggested or even written herself. But despite my reservations, I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, honest hope that maybe this was his way of extending an olive branch. Maybe becoming a father had softened his heart, helped him understand the sacrifices parents make for their children. Maybe time had given him perspective on my decision to sell the farm. I called the number listed on the invitation and spoke to a pleasant woman at Mountain View Lodge who confirmed my reservation and gave me directions. The drive would take about 4 hours through some of the most beautiful country in Montana and Colorado. Late September was perfect timing. The aspen leaves would be turning gold, and the air would be crisp and clean. The silence between us had started small, the way these family rifts usually do, a missed Christmas dinner, because Patricia's family was hosting, and it would be too complicated to coordinate both families. Forgotten Mother's Days that passed with no call, no card, no acknowledgement. Phone calls that went straight to voicemail, messages that were never returned. After Emma was born, I had hoped things would change. I had driven to Denver for the birth, sat in the hospital waiting room for 12 hours, only to learn later that they would send someone else to inform me of her arrival while I was in the cafeteria getting coffee. I had missed the actual moment of my granddaughter's birth because no one thought to tell me when to come back. The few times I had been allowed to see Emma over the years had been stilted, awkward affairs. Patricia would hover nervously as if I might contaminate the child somehow. Marcus would make polite conversation but keep checking his watch, clearly waiting for an appropriate amount of time to pass so they could leave. Emma herself was a beautiful child, with Marcus's dark eyes and Patricia's delicate features. But she was shy around me, clinging to her parents, and regarding me with the wariness children reserve for strangers, which I supposed was exactly what I would become to her. After I sold the farm to pay for my heart surgery last spring, Marcus had finally erupted with 3 years' worth of stored resentment. He had accused me of being selfish, of destroying his inheritance, of not consulting him before making such a monumental decision. We had exchanged harsh words that neither of us could take back, words that had created a chasm between us that seemed impossible to bridge. But maybe this invitation meant something. Maybe Patricia had finally convinced him that holding grudges was exhausting and pointless. Maybe becoming a grandfather to little Emma had reminded him that family connections are fragile and precious. Maybe he had realized that life is too short to waste on anger and pride. I packed my warmest clothes, knowing that mountain weather in September could be unpredictable. I included my blood pressure medication, my heart pills, and the inhaler I sometimes needed when the altitude affected my breathing. I packed comfortable walking shoes and a warm jacket, a couple of books in case there were quiet moments, and a small gift for Emma, a hand-carved wooden horse I had bought at the local craft fair, thinking of her every time I saw it in my bedroom. Most importantly, I packed hope. I folded it carefully between my sweaters and tucked it into the corners of my suitcase, a small but precious cargo that I prayed wouldn't be damaged in transit. Mountain View Lodge sat nestled between towering pines and jagged peaks, like something out of a postcard, the kind of place wealthy Denver families escape to for weekend retreats and corporate bonding experiences. The main building was all rustic wood and stone, constructed from massive logs that must have been harvested from some ancient forest. Huge windows overlooked a pristine lake that reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror, doubling the majesty of the landscape. The circular drive was paved with natural stone, winding through carefully maintained gardens that showcased native wildflowers and ornamental grasses. Even in late September, the landscaping was immaculate, with not a single weed or fallen leaf out of place. This was clearly a place where money was no object, where every detail had been considered and perfected. As my taxi pulled up to the entrance, I spotted Marcus waiting on the wraparound porch that stretched across the entire front of the main building. He was leaning against one of the massive support columns, checking his phone with that impatient gesture I remembered from his teenage years. He looked older than his 42 years, graying at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than aged. His hair was shorter than I remembered, styled in that deliberately casual way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He wore an expensive flannel shirt in deep forest green, the kind with mother-of-pearl buttons and perfect seams that screamed designer brand. His jeans were dark and pressed, paired with leather boots that looked like they had never seen actual hiking. Everything about his appearance suggested success and affluence, from the expensive watch on his wrist to the casual way he wore clothes that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Patricia stood beside him in designer hiking boots that had clearly never touched a trail and a cashmere sweater and soft cream that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and her makeup was flawless, despite the mountain setting. She looked like she had stepped out of one of those lifestyle magazines that feature articles about rustic luxury and authentic wilderness experiences for people who have never actually been uncomfortable in their lives. She was holding Emma, now 3 years old, who had grown from the chubby toddler I remembered into a delicate child with enormous dark eyes and fine blonde hair that curled around her ears. Emma was wearing a miniature version of her mother's outfit, tiny hiking boots, perfectly coordinated clothing, and a small backpack that probably contained nothing more practical than crackers and a juice box. "Dorothy," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness I remembered from his teenage years when he wanted something, when he was buttering me up for a later request for money or permission to do something I wouldn't approve of. "You made it. How was the drive?" The sound of my first name coming from his lips still felt strange and wrong after all these years. In my heart, I would always be Mom to him, no matter how much distance Patricia had managed to create between us. But I smiled and walked toward him, noting how he shifted his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit he had had since childhood. He hugged me carefully, gingerly, like I might break if he applied too much pressure. It was the kind of hug you give to an elderly relative you barely know, polite but lacking any real warmth or familiarity. His cologne was expensive and subtle, something woodsy and masculine that probably came in a bottle that cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. Patricia offered a brief smile that never reached her eyes and a pat on my shoulder that lasted exactly the socially appropriate amount of time. Her perfume was lighter than Marcus's cologne, but equally expensive, something floral and sophisticated that made me suddenly aware of my own simple soap and drugstore moisturizer. "Hello, Dorothy," she said in that carefully modulated voice she had perfected, the one that managed to sound warm and welcoming while simultaneously maintaining an invisible distance. "You look well. The mountain air will be good for you." Emma hid her face in her mother's neck, peeking out at me with one curious eye before disappearing again. She didn't remember me, of course. 3 years was a lifetime to a child, and our previous encounters had been too brief and infrequent to leave any lasting impression. "Emma, can you say hello to Grandma Dorothy?" Patricia prompted gently, but Emma only burrowed deeper into her mother's embrace. The title felt hollow and formal, like something from a children's book about families that bore no resemblance to our reality. I was Dorothy to this child, not Grandma, not Nana, not any of the warm, familiar names I had dreamed of hearing from my son's children. I was just another adult in her world, someone her parents were polite to, but who held no special significance in her young life. The lodge staff appeared as if by magic to collect my small suitcase, their movements practiced and discreet. They wore matching polo shirts with the lodge logo and khaki pants, their smiles professional and welcoming. I could tell immediately that this was the kind of place where guests never had to think about mundane details, like luggage or room keys or directions. Marcus walked beside me as we entered the main building, pointing out various amenities with the enthusiasm of a tour guide. The lobby was breathtaking, with soaring ceilings crossed by massive wooden beams and a stone fireplace large enough to walk into. Native American artwork decorated the walls, and the furniture was that perfect blend of rustic and luxurious that made you feel like you were camping without any of the actual inconveniences of outdoor life. "They have a spa," Marcus said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with river rock. "Patricia thought you might enjoy a massage or maybe a facial. They also have guided nature walks, though nothing too strenuous. There is a library with a great view of the lake, and the dining room serves locally sourced organic food." He was trying too hard, speaking too fast, his voice carrying that slightly manic edge I remembered from times when he felt guilty about something. As a child, he had used that same tone when confessing to breaking something or getting a bad grade, hoping that his enthusiasm about making amends would overshadow the original transgression. The cabin they had reserved for me was charming in the way that only expensive accommodations can manage, rustic enough to feel authentic, but luxurious enough that you never forgot you were paying premium prices for the experience. All knotty pine walls and exposed beams, with a stone fireplace that looked like it had been transplanted from some pioneer homestead. The bed was massive, covered in handmade quilts and piled high with down pillows. Fresh wildflowers sat on the nightstand in a mason jar, and someone had stocked the mini fridge with my favorite ginger ale and bottles of water with the lodge's logo. A basket of local treats sat on the small dining table, artisanal crackers, locally made jam, a selection of herbal teas in beautiful tins. But it was the small details that really caught my attention. The books on the bedside table were all titles I would enjoy: a mystery novel by an author I had mentioned, loving years ago, a collection of nature essays, a book of poetry by a writer I had discovered at the library. Someone had clearly given thought to what I might like to read, what would make me feel welcome and comfortable. For a moment, standing in that beautiful space surrounded by thoughtful touches, I allowed myself to believe that this reunion might actually heal the wounds between us. Maybe Marcus had spent time thinking about what would make me happy. Maybe Patricia had softened her stance and encouraged him to rebuild our relationship. Maybe becoming parents had helped them understand the depth of love that connects family members across time and distance and disagreement. That first dinner was held in the lodge's private dining room, an intimate space that could accommodate maybe a dozen people at most. Our table was set for 4, with white linens and real silver crystal water glasses that caught the light from the chandelier overhead and fresh flowers that matched the ones in my cabin. The room had windows on 3 sides, offering views of the lake and mountains that were breathtaking even in the fading light of evening. Marcus ordered wine for the adults, expensive bottles with French names I couldn't pronounce and vintage years that probably predated Emma's birth. He made a show of tasting each selection and nodding his approval to the sommelier, a ritual that seemed designed more to demonstrate his sophistication than to ensure the wine was acceptable. Patricia served me chamomile tea from a delicate porcelain pot, the kind with tiny flowers painted along the rim and a gold handle that caught the candlelight. She poured it with careful precision, adding honey from a small crystal jar and stirring it clockwise 3 times before sliding the cup across the table with a gentle smile. "I read that chamomile is good for circulation," she said, her tone suggesting that she had researched this specifically for my benefit. "And the honey is local, they keep bees right here on the property." I sipped the tea slowly, enjoying its mild sweetness and the delicate floral aroma that rose with the steam. It was perfectly brewed, neither too strong nor too weak, and the honey added just the right amount of sweetness without overwhelming the subtle flavor of the chamomile. While we ate, Marcus told stories about his expanding software company, speaking with animation about new contracts and innovative solutions and the challenges of managing a growing team. His business was clearly thriving, and I felt a surge of maternal pride listening to him describe his success. Whatever our personal differences, I was genuinely happy that he had built something meaningful and profitable. Patricia discussed Emma's preschool applications with the kind of intensity usually reserved for college admissions. She talked about waiting lists and interviews, educational philosophies, and extracurricular enrichment, as if choosing the right preschool would determine Emma's entire future. The pressure she was putting on herself, and by extension on Emma, seemed exhausting. But I bit my tongue and listened supportively. They asked polite questions about my volunteer work at the library, where I helped with the literacy program for adults who had never learned to read properly. They inquired about my new apartment in town, my health, my daily routines. Their questions were appropriate and considerate, showing interest without being intrusive. Everything felt civil, almost warm. Marcus laughed at my stories about Mrs. Henderson's daily adventures with her ancient dog. Patricia seemed genuinely interested when I described the book club I had started for seniors at the community center. Even Emma warmed up slightly, accepting a small piece of bread from my plate and favoring me with a shy smile. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I sensed something else. A tension, like the air before a thunderstorm, when everything looks normal but feels charged with potential energy. The way Marcus kept checking his phone, even though we were supposed to be having family time. How Patricia's smile never quite reached her eyes, remaining pleasant but somehow distant. The careful way they both watched me drink my tea, as if monitoring my consumption was somehow important. Marcus would lean forward when I raised the cup to my lips, and Patricia would pause mid-sentence to watch me swallow. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But after years of reading people's body language as a county clerk dealing with nervous applicants and anxious petitioners, I had developed an instinct for when something wasn't quite right. I chalked it up to nerves and the awkwardness of trying to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. We were all out of practice being a family, all trying too hard to make this work. The artificial quality of our interactions probably just reflected how much effort we were all putting into making this reunion successful. The second day began with breakfast delivered to my cabin by a young man who introduced himself as Tyler, a college student who worked part-time at the resort to help pay for his tuition. He was probably 21 or 22, with the kind of earnest, hard-working demeanor that reminded me of Marcus at that age, back when he was still my son instead of a stranger who shared my DNA. Tyler carried a covered tray that contained fresh fruit arranged in artistic patterns, Greek yogurt with local honey, and coffee that smelled rich and inviting but tasted slightly off once I added cream. There was something bitter underneath the expected coffee flavor, something that made me wrinkle my nose and set the cup down after just a few sips. "Is everything all right with the coffee, madam?" Tyler asked, noticing my expression. "I can bring you a different blend if you would like. We have several varieties." I shook my head, not wanting to cause trouble or seem like a difficult guest. "It is fine, dear, probably just the altitude affecting my taste buds." But Tyler frowned and made a note on his service clipboard, as if my comment about the coffee was worth remembering. There was something in his expression, a flicker of concern that seemed disproportionate to a simple complaint about beverages. By mid-morning, I felt strangely foggy, like I was thinking through cotton batting or trying to remember something important while half asleep. My hands trembled slightly as I brushed my teeth, and I had to sit down twice while getting dressed, because my balance felt unsteady. My heart seemed to be beating irregularly, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, with occasional fluttering sensations that made me press my palm against my chest. I blamed it on the altitude and my age, on the excitement of seeing Marcus again after so long, on the rich food and wine from the night before. At 67, I was used to my body not working quite as efficiently as it once had. My arthritis was worse in cold weather, my blood pressure required daily medication, and I sometimes felt dizzy when standing up too quickly. But this felt different somehow. Not exactly sick, but not quite right either. Like someone had adjusted the settings on my body without telling me, making everything just a little bit off kilter. Marcus knocked on my door around noon, suggesting we take a walk around the lake. He wore expensive hiking gear that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this trip. Boots so new they probably still had the tags on them that morning, a fleece jacket in coordinating colors, and one of those technical shirts designed to wick moisture away from the skin. "The fresh air will do you good," he said, offering his arm as we stepped outside. "Patricia read that moderate exercise helps with circulation issues." The comment struck me as odd. I didn't have circulation issues, at least none that I had mentioned to them. My heart condition was well managed with medication, and my doctor had assured me that I was in good health for my age. Why would Patricia be researching circulation problems unless she knew something I didn't? As we strolled along the gravel path that circled the lake, Marcus brought up the farm again, but more gently this time than during our last terrible argument. He said he understood why I had sold it, that my health had to come first, that he respected my decision even if it had been difficult for him to accept initially. "I have had time to think about it," he said, his arm linked through mine as if to steady me, though I noticed he was the one controlling our pace and direction. "You did what you had to do, and I shouldn't have reacted the way I did." I felt a surge of relief and gratitude at his words. This was the conversation I had been hoping for, the acknowledgement that my decision had been sound and necessary rather than selfish or spiteful. Maybe time really had given him perspective on the situation. But then he continued, and his words took on a different tone. "The thing is, Dorothy, Patricia and I have been thinking about the future, about what happens as you get older, as your health needs become more complex. We want to make sure you are taken care of if anything happens." There was something patronizing in his voice now, something that made me feel like a child being lectured rather than an adult having a conversation with her grown son. He was speaking to me the way people speak to elderly relatives they consider incapable of making their own decisions. "I am not getting any younger either," he continued, glancing at me sideways as if assessing my physical condition. "Patricia and I have Emma to think about, college funds to build, our own retirement to plan for. But we want to make sure we can be there for you when you need us." I nodded politely, though something about his tone made me uneasy. There was an underlying message in his words, something about burden and obligation, and the inconvenience of caring for aging parents. He was being kind and considerate on the surface, but underneath, I heard the familiar note of resentment that had colored so many of our recent interactions. Later that afternoon, Patricia stopped by my cabin with a manila envelope full of paperwork, the kind of thick legal documents that always made my eyes glaze over with their dense paragraphs and incomprehensible language. She spread them across my small dining table with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, explaining that they were just preliminary forms to make things easier down the road. Power of attorney papers that would give Marcus control over my financial decisions. Healthcare directives that would allow him to make medical choices on my behalf. Bank account access forms that would let him monitor and manage my spending. All of it presented as practical planning, reasonable precautions for a woman of my age. Each document had little yellow sticky notes marking where I should sign, like a roadmap through the legal complexity. Patricia's manicured fingers pointed to various paragraphs as she explained their purpose, her voice taking on the patient tone people use when explaining things to children or the mentally impaired. Nothing urgent, she assured me, her smile warm and reassuring. Just some legal housekeeping. Marcus thought it would be smart to have everything in order, given your recent health scares. Recent health scares? My heart surgery had been over a year ago, and I had recovered completely according to my cardiologist. I hadn't had any health emergencies or concerning symptoms since then. Why were they talking about my health as if I was declining or at risk? I told her I had need time to review everything with my attorney back home, a response that caused her smile to tighten almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flickered across her face: irritation. Maybe, or disappointment that I wasn't simply signing whatever they put in front of me. Of course, she said, gathering the papers back into their envelope. Though you might want to mention to your attorney that these documents were prepared by some of the best estate planning lawyers in Denver. We spared no expense to make sure everything was done properly. The implication was clear. They had invested money and effort in preparing these documents, and my reluctance to sign them was ungrateful and unreasonable. I was being difficult by wanting to consult my own legal counsel rather than simply trusting their judgment. That evening's dinner felt different from the night before. The same elegant dining room, the same pristine table setting, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Marcus seemed anxious, constantly refilling my wine glass and pushing the bread basket in my direction, as if keeping me well, fed and slightly intoxicated was somehow important to his plans. Patricia kept asking if I was feeling all right, if I needed anything for my headache, if the altitude was bothering me. The problem was, I hadn't mentioned having a headache, and while I did feel slightly off balance, I hadn't complained about altitude sickness either. How did she know I wasn't feeling well, unless she was responsible for making me feel that way? The tea came again, this time in a beautiful blue cup with gold trim that caught the candlelight and made the liquid inside seem to glow. Patricia poured it herself with the same careful precision as the night before, adding honey from the crystal jar and stirring it exactly 3 times before sliding it across the table. But tonight, as I lifted the cup to my lips, I noticed something I had missed before. The liquid had an odd sheen to it, almost oily, like a thin film floating on the surface. I attributed it to the honey not dissolving properly, but something about it made me hesitate. The chamomile scent was there, familiar and soothing, but underneath it was something else, something metallic and sharp, like the taste of pennies or the smell of medicine. I inhaled more deeply, trying to identify the foreign element, and felt Tyler appear beside our table to refill the water glasses. As he leaned over to reach my glass, positioning himself between me and Marcus's line of sight, he whispered barely audibly, "Don't drink that." The words were so quiet I almost thought I had imagined them. Tyler moved on to the next table, without making eye contact, his movements casual and professional, giving no indication that he had spoken to me at all. But my heart started racing, and I felt a cold fear settle in my stomach like a stone. My heart stuttered like an engine missing a beat. I set the cup down quickly, more forcefully than I had intended, causing a small splash of tea to land on the white tablecloth. I pretended to cough into my napkin, using the gesture to cover my shock and give myself a moment to process what I had just heard. Tyler moved on to the next table without making eye contact. His movements casual and professional, refilling water glasses and clearing bread plates as if nothing had happened. But I could feel the weight of his warning settling over me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe normally. Don't drink that. 4 simple words that shattered the fragile hope I had been nurturing since receiving Marcus's invitation. 4 words that transformed this family reunion from a potential healing into something sinister and frightening. I excused myself to the restroom, my legs unsteady as I walked across the dining room. Every step felt deliberate and difficult, like walking through deep sand or thick mud. My hands were shaking as I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and I had to grip the sink for support as I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror. My face looked pale, almost gray in the soft lighting, with dark circles under my eyes that hadn't been there that morning. My pupils looked strange too, dilated, despite the bright lights, giving my eyes an unfocused, glassy appearance. I looked like someone who was sick, or drugged, or both. In the privacy of the bathroom stall, I unfolded Tyler's note with trembling fingers, the paper crackling loudly in the silence. His handwriting was rushed but legible, the words written in blue ink that had smeared slightly from the moisture on his hands. Your daughter-in-law has been adding something to your drinks. I saw her with a small bottle yesterday. Meet me by the lake dock at midnight if you want to know more. I read the words 3 times, each reading making them more real and more terrifying. This couldn't be happening. Not Marcus. Not my son. The child I had rocked to sleep during countless fever-filled nights. The boy who had brought me dandelions picked from the yard, their stems sticky with white sap and their bright yellow heads already wilting in his small fist. But even as I tried to deny it, pieces began falling into place, like a jigsaw puzzle I had been trying to solve, without realizing what the final image would show. The sudden invitation after years of silence. The legal papers presented so casually, as if signing away my autonomy was just routine paperwork. The way they both watched me drink, monitoring my consumption like scientists, observing a laboratory experiment. The strange taste in everything I had been drinking since I arrived. The way I had been feeling foggy, unsteady, not quite myself. Patricia's comments about my health, as if she knew something about my condition that I didn't. Marcus's patronizing tone when discussing my future, as if my decline was already inevitable. I returned to the table on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. My tea sitting exactly where I had left it, the surface still reflecting the candlelight like a mirror. Patricia looked up expectantly, her expression carefully arranged in a mask of concern. Feeling better, Dorothy? She asked, her voice carrying just the right note of sympathy. You looked a little pale. Maybe you should drink your tea, the warmth might help settle your stomach. I nodded and picked up my fork, pushing food around my plate while my mind raced through possibilities and implications. For the rest of the meal, I pretended to sip my tea without actually drinking it, tilting the cup to my lips but keeping my mouth closed, letting the liquid touch my lips but not allowing any of it to enter my system. It was a performance that required careful timing and subtle movements. When Marcus or Patricia looked directly at me, I would raise the cup and mime drinking. When they were distracted by Emma or looking at their own food, I would set the cup down and pretend to dab my lips with my napkin. The deception felt exhausting, requiring constant vigilance and split-second decision-making. But with each fake sip, I felt my mind clearing slightly, as if whatever they had been giving me was beginning to wear off. My hands steadied, my vision sharpened, and the fog that had been clouding my thoughts began to lift. When Patricia offered to walk me back to my cabin after dinner, I declined, saying I needed some fresh air first and wanted to enjoy the beautiful evening. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of being alone with her, of having to maintain my pretense of ignorance while she continued to manipulate and deceive me. Don't stay out too late, Marcus said, his tone carrying that false note of parental concern. The temperature drops quickly up here after sunset, And we don't want you catching cold." I promised to be careful, and walked slowly toward the lake, every step taking me further from the warm lights of the lodge, and deeper into the shadows of the surrounding forest. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to illuminate the path, but the darkness beyond felt thick and concealing. Midnight came slowly, each minute stretching like an hour as I sat on a bench near the water's edge, wrapped in my warmest coat and listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and wood smoke from the lodge's fireplaces. Under different circumstances, it would have been peaceful, even magical. But tonight, every sound made me jump. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every footstep on the gravel path could be Marcus or Patricia coming to check on me, to ask what I was doing out so late, to ensure I hadn't discovered their secret. Tyler appeared like a ghost materializing from the darkness, moving quietly along the shoreline until he reached the small dock where I was waiting. He was smoking a cigarette, the red ember glowing like a tiny beacon in the darkness, and pacing nervously, as if he couldn't decide whether coming here was a good idea or a terrible mistake. "I didn't know if you would come," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the water's gentle sounds. "I have been working here for 2 years, and I have never seen anything like this." I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he had taken through the dining room window. The image was grainy and taken from a distance, but it clearly showed Patricia at our table, leaning over my teacup with a small brown bottle in her hand. She was pouring something from the bottle into the cup, her movements quick and furtive, her eyes scanning the room to make sure no one was watching. But Tyler had been watching, and he had been smart enough to document what he saw. "What is it?" I whispered, staring at the damning image on his phone screen. "I don't know for sure, but my girlfriend is pre-med at Colorado State, and she recognized the bottle when I showed her the picture. She thinks it is digitalis, something that affects heart rhythm. It is derived from foxglove plants, and in small doses, it can cause confusion, weakness, make someone seem like they are developing dementia." The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable landing with the force of a hammer strike. I gripped the dock railing to keep from falling, my knees suddenly weak and unreliable. Digitalis. I knew that name from my research, after my heart surgery, when I would become intensely interested in learning everything I could about cardiac medications and their effects. Digitalis was powerful and dangerous, used in carefully controlled doses to treat certain heart conditions. But in the wrong hands and the wrong amounts, it could be deadly. Tyler continued, his voice urgent and frightened. "They have been talking about your will, about how you are not thinking clearly anymore. I heard them yesterday morning in the main lobby, discussing whether you would be declared incompetent soon. They were talking about it like it was a foregone conclusion, like they were just waiting for the right paperwork to be filed." I stood there in the cold mountain air, everything suddenly crystal clear despite the darkness around us. They weren't trying to kill me outright. That would be too suspicious, too likely to trigger an investigation. They were slowly poisoning me to make me seem mentally incapacitated, gradually undermining my cognitive abilities until I appeared confused and unreliable. Once I seemed incompetent, the legal documents Patricia had prepared would allow them to take control of everything I had left. They could make my medical decisions, manage my finances, even have me institutionalized if I became inconvenient or tried to resist their plans. It was brilliant in its subtlety and terrifying in its implications. They could steal everything from me while appearing to be caring family members looking out for my best interests. Everyone would see devoted children taking care of their declining mother, not predators systematically destroying their victim's life. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. Tyler stubbed out his cigarette and looked around nervously, as if he expected Marcus or Patricia to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "I saved some of your tea from tonight in a small container. My girlfriend says we can get it tested at the lab where she works, but it might take a few days to get results. In the meantime, don't drink anything they give you, and maybe you should call someone, a lawyer, The police. Somebody who can help. He handed me a small plastic container, the kind used for salad dressing samples, with about an ounce of my evening tea inside. The liquid looked innocent enough in the moonlight. But I knew it contained evidence of their betrayal, proof that my own family was willing to destroy my mind and steal my independence for money. I thanked him and made my way back to my cabin, my mind churning with plans and possibilities, and the horrible realization that I was completely alone in this fight. Inside, I found the manila envelope Patricia had left, still sitting on my table, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. I read through every document carefully this time, understanding now what they really meant. Complete control over my finances, allowing them to sell my house and manage my assets as they saw fit. Authority to make my healthcare decisions, meaning they could have me committed to a facility or subjected to treatments I didn't want. Power to act as my legal representatives, speaking for me in situations where I couldn't speak for myself. They could have me declared incompetent and institutionalized, then sell my house and keep the proceeds while claiming they were paying for my care. They could move me to the cheapest facility they could find while pocketing the difference. They could make every decision about my life while I sat helpless and confused, my mind clouded by the drugs they fed me. The most insidious part was how reasonable it all seemed on the surface. Adult children helping their aging parent with legal planning, caring family members ensuring their loved one received proper medical care. It would look like love and responsibility to anyone who didn't know the truth. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window watching the sunrise paint, the mountains in shades of pink and gold, planning my next move. I was trapped in this beautiful place with people who wanted to destroy me. But I wasn't helpless. I had evidence now, and allies, and most importantly, I knew what they were doing. The fog was lifting from my mind, and with clarity came anger. Not the hot, explosive rage that burns out quickly, but the slow, steady fury that sustains you through long battles. They had underestimated me, assuming that age had made me weak and gullible. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The following morning, I told Marcus I wasn't feeling well and would be spending the day resting in my cabin. He seemed pleased by this news, offering to have meals delivered, so I wouldn't have to exert myself. I accepted graciously, then called my attorney's office the moment he left. Margaret Phillips had been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since Robert died and left me drowning in paperwork. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, her silence growing more ominous with each detail. "Dorothy," she said finally, "Marcus contacted my office last month asking about your mental capacity and whether I had noticed any decline in your cognitive abilities during our recent meetings." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were sharp as ever and that if he had concerns about your well-being, he should discuss them with you directly. But now, given what you are telling me, I think we need to take immediate action." She advised me to get the tea sample tested as soon as possible and to document everything. She also suggested I discreetly record any conversations with Marcus and Patricia if I could manage it safely. I spent the day pretending to rest while actually planning. When Tyler brought my lunch, he slipped me a small digital recorder he had borrowed from the lodge's audiovisual equipment. That evening, I joined Marcus and Patricia for dinner with the recorder hidden in my sweater pocket. The conversation started innocuously enough: Emma's first day at preschool, the beautiful weather, plans for tomorrow's hiking trip. But as the evening progressed and Patricia poured my usual tea, Marcus began steering the discussion toward my future. "Dorothy, Patricia and I have been talking, and we are worried about you living alone. This trip has made us realize how isolated you have become since moving to that apartment." I took a pretend sip of tea and nodded encouragingly. Patricia leaned forward, her voice full of false concern. "We have looked into some lovely assisted living facilities near us. Nothing institutional, just a nice community where you would have people to look after you." "But I am managing fine on my own," I protested mildly, playing the role they expected. Marcus reached across the table and patted my hand. "Mom, you are forgetting things. You seem confused sometimes. Yesterday you asked me the same question 3 times. I hadn't asked him any questions yesterday, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I let him continue building his case while the recorder captured every word. The thing is, Patricia added, these places have waiting lists. We had need to get your name on the list soon, and that requires some preliminary paperwork. She pulled out the familiar manila envelope. The same documents from before, but with additional pages now. I pretended to study them with growing confusion, asking simple questions that made me sound increasingly befuddled. I don't understand all this legal language, I said, playing up the tremor in my voice. Maybe you could just tell me where to sign. They exchanged a look of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. For the next hour, they patiently explained how signing these papers would make everything so much easier for everyone, how they would handle all the complicated financial decisions so I wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. By the time we finished, I had them on record discussing their plans to have me declared incompetent, sell my house, and move me into the cheapest care facility they could find while keeping the proceeds from my assets. The next morning, I called Margaret again and played her the recording. Her sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. Dorothy, this is elder abuse, plain and simple. We need to contact the authorities immediately. But I had a different plan in mind. I spent that day making phone calls from my cabin, while Marcus and Patricia took Emma on a nature walk. First, I called Dr. Harrison, my longtime physician, and asked him to arrange for immediate blood tests when I returned home. Then I called the lab Tyler had recommended and arranged to have the T sample analyzed. Most importantly, I called Janet Morrison, the investigative reporter who had written that series about nursing home fraud in our local newspaper. When I explained the situation, she was immediately interested. Mrs. Crawford, would you be willing to let me document this story? With your permission, I would like to have a photographer capture some evidence and interview you on record about what is happening. I agreed. With one condition: the story wouldn't run until after I had had my final conversation with Marcus and Patricia. That evening's dinner was different. I arrived early and asked the kitchen staff to prepare my own tea at my table, claiming I wanted to learn to make it the way Patricia did since it always tasted so much better when she prepared it. The young server, unaware of the undercurrents, cheerfully brought me a plain cup of chamomile tea with honey on the side. When Marcus and Patricia arrived, I was sitting calmly with my hands folded, the unsigned legal documents spread neatly across the table. Patricia's eyes immediately went to the papers, then to my untouched teacup. "Dorothy, you haven't touched your tea," she observed, reaching for the pot to pour me a fresh cup. "Actually, I have been thinking about those papers," I said pleasantly. "I had some questions." Marcus sat down eagerly. "Of course, Mom. What would you like to know?" I picked up the power of attorney document and pretended to study it carefully. "Well, this section here about healthcare decisions. If I sign this, you would be able to make medical choices for me even if I disagreed. Only if you weren't capable of making good decisions yourself," Patricia assured me. "It is really just a safety net, I see. And this part about my house, you would be able to sell it without asking me? Only if it was in your best interest," Marcus said smoothly. "If you needed the money for medical care, for instance." I nodded thoughtfully, then reached into my purse and pulled out a different set of documents, ones Margaret had prepared the day before. "That is interesting because I have prepared some papers of my own." The change in atmosphere was immediate. Marcus straightened in his chair while Patricia's hand froze halfway to the teapot. "What kind of papers?" Marcus asked carefully. I spread them out next to his documents. "A new will, actually, and a restraining order. Oh, and a complaint I am filing with the district attorney's office regarding attempted elder abuse and poisoning." Patricia went pale. "Dorothy, what are you talking about?" I pulled out Tyler's photo of her doctoring my tea and placed it gently on the table between us. "I am talking about digitalis, Patricia, about your systematic attempt to make me appear mentally incompetent so you could steal my remaining assets." Marcus started to sputter denials, but I held up my hand. "I am also talking about this." I produced the digital recorder and played back their conversation from the previous evening, their voices clearly discussing my impending incompetency and their plans for my money. The silence that followed was deafening. "Here is what is going to happen," I continued calmly. "Tomorrow morning, I am driving back to Montana with a full police report, blood test results, and lab analysis of the tea you have been serving me. Janet Morrison from the newspaper will be publishing a detailed account of your scheme, complete with photos and recordings." Patricia finally found her voice. "You cannot prove anything. It is just tea." I smiled sadly. "Actually, I can prove quite a lot. Dr. Harrison ran preliminary blood tests yesterday. There are definitive traces of cardiac glycosides in my system. The lab confirmed digitalis in the tea sample, and Tyler has been documenting your activities for days." Marcus leaned forward aggressively. "You are making a mistake, Mom. We were trying to help you." "No, Marcus. You were trying to rob me. There is a difference." I stood up slowly, gathering my documents. "I have already changed my will. Everything I own will go to charity when I die. You will not receive a single penny." Patricia's carefully controlled facade finally cracked. "You crazy old woman. You cannot do this to us. We have expenses, obligations. You should have thought of that before you decided to poison me." I walked away from that table with my head held high, leaving them sitting in stunned silence. The next morning, I checked out early and drove home to Montana, where Margaret was waiting with a complete legal strategy. The blood tests confirmed significant levels of digitalis in my system. The tea sample analysis showed dangerous concentrations of the drug. Tyler provided witness testimony, and the digital recordings captured Marcus and Patricia discussing their plans in detail. The local district attorney filed charges of attempted elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and administering drugs without consent. The story Janet Morrison published sent shockwaves through our small community, where Marcus had been seen as a successful businessman and devoted son. More importantly to me, I was free. Free from their manipulation, their false concern, their greedy plans for my future. I spent my 68th birthday surrounded by real friends at the library, cutting a cake and sharing stories with people who valued me for who I was, not what I owned. Marcus and Patricia eventually accepted a plea bargain that included probation, community service, and a permanent restraining order, keeping them away from me. They moved to another state, taking Emma with them. I grieved for the loss of my granddaughter, but I knew I had made the right choice. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting back dramatically or seeking revenge. Sometimes it is about quietly documenting the truth, building a case methodically, and then standing up calmly when the moment is right. 6 months later, I received a letter from Tyler, who had graduated and started medical school with help from a scholarship I would quietly funded. He wrote that our experience had inspired him to specialize in geriatric medicine, focusing on protecting elderly patients from abuse. I also heard from 3 other women whose adult children had attempted similar schemes after reading Janet's article. They reached out for advice, for support, for the courage to protect themselves. Each of them found the strength to document their situations and seek help. My small apartment became my sanctuary. I kept fresh flowers on the table, drank tea that I prepared myself, and slept peacefully knowing I was safe. The money I had saved from my house sale went into a trust fund, supporting elder abuse prevention programs. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about the little boy Marcus, used to be the one who would crawl into my lap after nightmares, who brought me dandelions he had picked from the yard, who once told me I was the best mother in the whole world. I mourned that child while accepting that the man he would become was someone I no longer recognized. But mostly, I thought about the woman I had discovered I could be when everything was at stake. Strong enough to sit calmly while being poisoned, smart enough to gather evidence methodically, brave enough to stand up to family members who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are capable of the deepest betrayal. But I also learned that you are never too old to fight for yourself, to demand respect, to refuse to be anyone's victim. The mountains of Colorado still looked beautiful in the travel magazines. But I never wanted to see them again. Instead, I found peace in the rolling hills of Montana, in my small circle of genuine friends, in the knowledge that I had faced the worst kind of betrayal and emerged with my dignity intact. Some storms are visible from miles away, dark clouds gathering, wind picking up, the air pressure dropping. But the most dangerous storms come disguised as sunny skies, wrapped in familiar faces, offered in cups of poisoned tea. I survived both kinds, and if you are facing your own storm, whether it is obvious or hidden, remember this: you are stronger than you know, smarter than they think, and more valuable than anyone who would hurt you deserves to realize. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And never ever drink the tea if something feels wrong. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who didn't have your best interests at heart? Your experiences might help someone else who is facing a similar situation. And if you found this story compelling, there are more tales of resilience and justice in my other posts. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful ones.